This is Illinois' Lost City, the Savannah Army Depot. At its peak, it was home to more than 7,000 workers and, in many ways, functioned like a small American town. The depot covered roughly 20 square miles, was crisscrossed by 140 miles of internal paved roads, and a surprising 68 miles of railroad track connecting the various factories and shops on site. It also had its own power plant, shopping center, theater, and living accommodations for the entire population. Oh, and I should probably point out that Savannah was better armed than most countries. So how did a weapons installation grow to be the size of a small city? And why was it ultimately abandoned? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the rise and fall of the Savannah Army Depot, Illinois' Lost City. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start back in the late 19th century, when the small city of Savannah, Illinois, had grown into one of the most consequential freight junctions on the upper Mississippi. Indeed, the area was on the cusp of economic transformation, stimulated by several Chicago-led railroads that all passed through this area. At their combined peak, the Savannah rail yards were switching 4,500 freight cars every single day, a volume that redefined the entire surrounding region. With that, the population climbed towards 5,000. Hotels went up, banks opened, and the infrastructure of a real city took shape along the river bluffs. Flush with new money, town leaders launched a wave of civic improvements. Sewers were built, telephones were installed, cement sidewalks replaced dirt paths, a public library opened, as parks were created along the Mississippi. And we should add that business was booming. However, a few decades later, when the US entered World War I and the federal government was looking for land, that local transformation would go into overdrive. For context, Rock Island Arsenal sat roughly 70 miles away, and it was one of the Army's primary weapons manufacturing facilities back in those times. However, there was a problem, as yes, it could produce artillery pieces by the hundreds, but it had no testing terrain. So what the arsenal really needed was an enormous stretch of flat, remote land where guns could be fired without threatening anyone. Yet at the same time, that land had to be well connected to things like the railway. Do you see where I'm going with this? Savannah Proving Grounds officially opened on December the 26th, 1918. And oddly, although the war it was built to support had ended 6 weeks earlier, construction expanded aggressively all the same. Well into 1920, artillery pieces rolled out of Rock Island and were tested here. By 1921, the site was redesignated the Savannah Ordnance Depot, with its purpose shifted from testing weapons to storing them. At this point, it cut ties with Rock Island and began operating independently. That same year, Savannah's population peaked at 5,237. By most counts, daily life in the area looked stable and ordinarily American, as military payroll had transformed the railroad junction into something with an even greater national purpose. So the residents, most of which were in service, never really considered what would happen to the base in the nearby town if that payroll disappeared. Remember, the base and the railroads together accounted for more than half the jobs, so there was really no third pillar. And things would remain this way until the Great Depression, when military budgets contracted. At the same time, the railroads were facing fierce competition, and so Savannah began rapidly losing people for the first time in its young history. Actually, by 1939, the place was practically a ghost town, as the base employed just 143 workers. But then, with the outbreak of World War II, residents returned en masse. Between 1939 and 42, the workplace expanded from that symbolic 143 people to 7,195. Accordingly, the physical footprint for the town and the base grew to match it. Roads were laid, warehouses went up, and a dedicated power plant was constructed to keep the installation running independently of the surrounding grid. There was also a commissary, a theater, and housing for the workforce, with more elegant officers' quarters set apart from the enlisted area. To keep things safe, the 516th Military Police Company provided security across the entire perimeter, manning guard shacks at controlled entry points along the fence line. For the soldiers stationed there, the base had everything a small town would, from an enlisted men's club to a swimming pool, and so the people felt happy there. One soldier stationed there in the 1960s later recalled counting 17 bars in the town of Savannah alone, and noted that the local residents treated the men in uniform like their family. As for the ammunition storage, well, that was unlike anything else ever built on American soil. The Army constructed 407 earth-covered magazines, each between 1,000 and 2,000 square feet of floor space, featuring 4-ton blast doors. Inside, each one stood 15 feet tall at the center, with 2 feet of concrete on the sides and back wall. Collectively, they ran 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. These structures were large enough to store everything from individual artillery rounds to 500-pound bombs. After construction, bulldozers covered the structures with 2 feet of topsoil and planted grass over the mounds, hiding them from aerial observation. And even today, if we look at satellite photos, we can see that from above, they really do look like a field of low, flowing hills. The design was deliberate in another way too. None of the magazines faced one another, so that if one exploded, it would be less likely to trigger the ones beside it. In January of 1948, that design philosophy was put to the test. One magazine, filled with landmines, got too cold. The liquid chemicals inside froze, resulting in an explosion that left a crater 100 feet wide by 50 feet deep. Now, there's some interesting local lore around this blast. Apparently, the 4-ton steel blast door was blown away, never to be found. Some locals believe that it might be at the bottom of the Mississippi. Finally, and my favorite part, these magazines were connected by 68 miles of internal railroad track. The tracks allowed ordnance to move between the facilities and storage fields without ever leaving the perimeter. Alongside the earth structures stood 156 large brick magazines for conventional munitions. At the center of the operation was the Group 1 shell loading plant. It was the only facility of its type in the US, capable of producing a class of lightweight munitions that no other institution could manufacture at scale. Apparently, many lightweight bombs later dropped on Tokyo had been manufactured and loaded at Savannah before being shipped to the fleet. Accordingly, the War Department took note of the depot's successful operation and awarded it with the Army-Navy E-Production Flag with 2 silver stars, which is the military's highest wartime production honor. Following World War II, the Army established their Defense Ammunition Center and School on the grounds, where it trained ordnance personnel from across the entire military. A development that cemented Savannah's role as something far more than a storage facility. By 1961, the site was classified as a special weapons mission. It would maintain that designation until 1975, and since the details remain restricted to this day, it's impossible to elaborate much further on that. What we do know is that in the early 1960s, Savannah operated at the most sensitive edge of the Cold War logistics apparatus. According to some sources, a soldier stationed there in '68 claimed that the base was put on activation alert twice, once during the Tet Offense in '68 and another time during the Chicago Democratic Convention riots. So that's all to say that this was no longer just a temporary base. It was a functioning city, fueling the local economy from behind a guarded fence, and things would stay that way until the outbreak of the Gulf War. During the Gulf War of '91, Savannah was operating at full capacity. A former employee later recalled a single 3-week stretch in which workers destroyed over 1 million pounds of defective propellant on the demolition grounds. So by every operational measure, the depot was performing exactly as designed. But the Gulf War put something else on television for the first time that politicians took note of: precision-guided munitions. Coalition aircraft were now able to strike specific targets with just one round. So in effect, a single weapon could now do what hundreds had previously done. With that, military planners and members of Congress concluded that the future of American air power was not volume, but accuracy. And so a facility built to store, maintain, and ship hundreds of thousands of conventional munitions suddenly looked less like a strategic asset and more like a legal burden. With that, in 1995, Congress added Savannah to the federal closure list, and seemingly overnight, employment had fallen to roughly just 500 workers. One former employee claimed that although rumors of the closure had circulated internally for years, the outcome still felt like a surprise. The Savannah Army Depot officially closed on March the 18th, 2000, though by that point, most of the damage to the local economy had already been done. Savannah lost nearly a quarter of its population between 1970 and 1990, well before the gates ever closed, making the closure just a final chapter of a story that had been ending for 30 years. The closure left behind 13,062 acres of barren roads, cement bunkers, and a mess of contamination from the many years of testing. Though, to be fair, the EPA had already placed the site on its Superfund National Priorities list back in 1989, and the cleanup had begun in 1990, continuing well past closure. In modern times, the Joe Carroll Redevelopment Authority took responsibility for approximately 3,000 acres that include things like the barracks, the commissary, the theater, officers' club, and most of the built infrastructure of the former base, whereas other parts of the land became the Savannah Depot Park, an industrial redevelopment zone, including things such as railcar storage and repair operations. In September of 2003, the Department of Defense transferred another 9,404 acres to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which, surprisingly, is the largest remnant of sand prairie in Illinois, and it's now home to 47 threatened and endangered species. As for those earth-covered magazines, well, most of the 409 structures still stand, although they are sealed off to the outside world. Though some urban explorers have made their way inside, documenting a range of artifacts including graffiti that dates back to 1951. And of course, one of these magazines still has that crater beside it at 100 feet wide by 30 feet deep, unchanged from that fateful night in 1948. So that's the story of the Savannah Army Depot, Illinois' lost city. I hope you all found it as fascinating as I did, and a special thanks to the viewer who recommended this story idea. Actually, guys, I created a new Google form, which is linked in the description, where any of you can submit topic ideas for the series, and if it's good, I promise I will make it. This form goes directly to a spreadsheet that I have bookmarked in my computer. I'm going to check it about once a week and really look forward to your ideas. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe, check out the members area, and forgive me for my poor pronunciation. Actually, funny thing, I was watching a documentary about George Bush last night, and I see that he makes many of the same pronunciation mistakes I did. So I figure, if an American president can do it, you should forgive me.